So here's another one of those great questions that doesn't seem like it should be a question at all. Who wrote the Who wrote the Gospels? All right, well, that's silly. It's the Gospel according to Mark. You turn, and it's the Gospel according to Matthew. Flip to the next one, and right there in the title, the Gospel according to Luke. Flip to the last one, it's right there in the title, the Gospel according to John. Okay, that will do it for this session of the podcast. Or the riddle is actually included in the way that I gave the answer. Did you notice that the title for each of the Gospels is exactly the same with the substitution of the name? Isn't that a little curious that everybody would give their Gospel the exact same title? Well, it turns out that all of our earliest manuscripts, extant manuscripts, meaning ones that we still have that exist, none of them have these titles on them. And scholars agree that the titles for the four Gospels in the New Testament were all given anywhere from 50 to 100 years later than when the Gospels were actually written. They also think that it was given by one particular person at one particular time. Hence the Gospel according to X. And they were all given at the same time. You see, when the Gospels were originally written, they were written on a scroll, which would be rolled up and then put away in the library shelf, and then a little tag eventually would be attached to it, and that would be the title. And the majority of works from antiquity wouldn't have titles at all. So if you think about all the different dialogues of Plato, they're typically named after one of the main characters that Socrates is having a conversation with, like Timaeus. So this raises a rather interesting phenomenon that not many people are aware of. If you remove the titles, because they're not original to the works, and you just go and you read the Gospel according to Matthew, nowhere in the Gospel does Matthew ever mention himself. It's an anonymous work, which is kind of curious, right? Because traditionally Matthew is one of the disciples who wrote the Gospel. But at no point does he ever say, and then Jesus said to me or to us or anything. It's third person. It's the same thing with Mark, Luke, and John. There's no attachment to a name of who it is who wrote the works. The closest that you get is with the Gospel of John, because at the very end, 21-24, it says, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true." So it's thought that the Gospel of John is written by the constantly referenced the beloved disciple. But again, if you read carefully, it never says the beloved disciple John. It's just the disciple. Now, if you do a little bit of detective work, there's a lot of clues in the text that makes one infer that it is John who is writing this text. But it never explicitly says so. So that's a very interesting thing. One of the interesting contrasts, though, with that is that if you have these four Gospels and they are anonymous, and all scholars agree they're anonymous, that's not to say that they weren't written by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But it is to say that the texts themselves don't say so. Tradition says so. And they very much stand apart from all of those other apocryphal Gospels that I have mentioned in the past, because those go to great pains as to identifying who it is who wrote them. The Evangelion of James at the very end says, "And I, James, he was hiding in the wilderness, and that's why I'm still alive and can write this." In the secret Gospels of John, they identify themselves as John. There's a Gospel of Peter, and it identifies the author as being Peter. They're pseudonymous. These are written much, much later, well after these disciples or apostles have passed away, but they're being written with that pen name to try to give them greater authority. And that is not something that happens with the four canonical Gospels. John's kind of a bridge in between there, in that there's clues to let you know that this should be read as having written by John, but it's not explicit. It becomes explicit in the 2nd century when all those other wonderful apocalyptic Gospels pop up. Now, it should also be stated that even though that these works are anonymous, technically speaking, it is fascinating that there's never any disagreement once the names get affixed to the works of them being assigned to someone else. For example, we do not have any manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark with a title instead saying the Gospel of Philip. It's always the Gospel of Mark, so that tradition gets set very, very early. We have what's called the Muratorian canon. Canon is a list of books, and we think that it was written in Rome maybe around 150 to 200. But it gives a little background as to the Gospels, and it gives a little background, for example, with John. So the tradition comes in with this, where before it talks about John, the Muratorian canon says this: the fourth of the Gospels, that of John, one of the disciples. When his fellow disciples and bishops urged him, he said, "Fast with me from today for 3 days, and what will be revealed to each one of us, let us relate to one another." In the same night, it was revealed to Andrew, one of the apostles, that whilst they were all to go over it, John, in his own name, should write everything down. So there's a very early account of the tradition of how the Gospel of John was written by John. But your little interesting takeaway from today is if you ever go and read them, you'll never see John's name in the Gospel being attached to being the author. So anyway, that will do it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will hopefully come back to you guys tomorrow on Good Friday and have a little bit to say about the crucifixion. So until then, be good, be safe, be your sister's keeper. Cheers.